We're very pleased to have Adrian Bell here from University of Utah, and he's going to talk to us about advancing our evolutionary understanding of migration. Remember, next week we don't have Beck because it's Memorial Day, and then the week after that is our final Beck Talk of the year with Peter Gray, our former undergrad, coming from UNLV.
Thank you. And so, good afternoon, everybody. Aloha.
Aloha.
Wait, do it again. Aloha.
Aloha.
I'm from Southern California, and it's great to be back here. And growing up with sort of in the shadow of UCLA, it's a pleasure to be here actually. And in all transparency, my work in migration stems from knowing its profound influence on cultures that I'm most familiar with, growing up in the Tongan diaspora here in Southern California. However, I'd like to argue in my talk, hope to convince you that the study of migration is central to evolutionary thinking, and today I'll offer a few examples to argue that. I've had wonderful colleagues and mentors who have either supported or assisted in my work, and I'm grateful especially to the mentors that have supported me at Davis, where I received my graduate degree, and currently at University of Utah, and the list is too long to put here. From my work with these great colleagues, I have learned that effectively addressing anthropological debates often requires tight integration of theoretical and empirical approaches, and of course, working with colleagues who have diverse interests other than your own, and also a message I wish to convey here today. The other message I'd like to present is about population thinking. Now, out of the many mechanisms that evolutionary theory has given us, in my mind, population thinking is one of the pillars of our theoretical and empirical work. While the birth and death process and its cultural analogs are often major players in human evolutionary research, migration may play the greater role for many of the questions about the human condition. A number of years ago, I was sitting outside the Internet Shack, right? Not a cafe, it was a shack, Internet Shack in Tonga. And I was chatting with a young Tongan woman who was visiting, right? This is her homeland. She told me, quote, "I hate it here." That comment puzzled me and surprised me. After all, she was visiting, right, the place where her parents are from and where her grandparents are from and so on. But what prompted her response is a piece of a puzzle, I think, that has likely shaped human society from the beginning. Genes alone can't predict her discontent with her parents being native to Tonga, at least her genealogy, nor perceptions about Tongan social norms, as she understood much of them. Rather, grasping what prompts her attitude relies on understanding her and her family's migration history. Raised in Australia, she sits outside this rustic shack of a internet shack, occupying a space that is not her own. Sometimes unsaid, migration and its effects on what we observe is a part of all evolutionary models. However, because migration is so influential, they each make very specific assumptions about its nature. And here's a few examples here we can read. Stepping stone models, often used by geneticists to provide a relationship between populations or genetic diversity. There's one-way migration from island to island. There's no leapfrogging, right? It's very constrained. Here we have metapopulation models by ecologists used to look at spatial population density, where you look at nodes, right, and connectivity between nodes, and lots of movement between these nodes, often occupation of these patches blinking on and off, meaning they're there or not. You have mainland island sort of structures of models. We're looking at effective migration rates, often by geneticists or heterosis. And you have one-way movement, right, from populations of different characteristics. You have island biogeography, many of you know, that looks at species diversity or predicts species diversity. And then you have one-way migration with decreasing flow of distance from island area. And of course, all of you know about Heidi Weinberg, at least it's one locus, sort of two-wheel version of it, where you have no migration. And and we could make the list longer, right? With all different models that are produced to understand, or at least to create empirical predictions that constrain what migration looks like, because many other theorists know that it's very influential. Little bits of migration can mean a lot, right, to the empirical patterns that we see. Here's one scholarly example, is Peter Bellwood's 2004 book, who reviews the vast extent to which the earliest human populations moved continuously into the historic period. You leave this book with the sense that migration and the interaction between differentiated populations appears to be a common aspect of human population history, mostly between populations that are close to each other. Perhaps a more direct indicator of the extent of intermarriage between groups, the extent of interaction between groups is intermarriage in small-scale societies. So, an economist interested in this, Dow et al. Published a paper in 2016, estimated a mean 53% exogamy rate for 178 societies in a standard cross-cultural sample. McDonald and Hewlett in a published paper in 1999 estimated a mating distances for 5 hunter-gatherer groups with group means ranging from 9 kilometers to nearly 70 kilometers, and an overall average of around 40 kilometers. All of this suggests that the outcomes of migration are essential to understanding our human evolutionary history as other more well-known processes that circle around the core concept of population thinking. So how do we do it? Right? How do we go about building and testing evolutionary theory concerning migration? Right? A lot of what I did mention before is often in anthropology we may interact with populations or choose population study because they have more or less contact with the outside world. Right? Especially today, where contact means market integration. Right? And at some point, avoiding that contact would prevent us from knowing some of the more fundamental parts of the human condition, is how the interaction between groups occurs, and that process. So how do we go about building and testing evolutionary theory concerning migration, the causes, the outcomes, and there's no direct, there's no deterministic way of doing this, right? Science is a messy process, but I'd like to use 3 of my research activities to illustrate what I've learned about the process, in addition to understanding, for particular case studies in the Pacific, the cause and effects of migration here. And I'd like to illustrate, the interplay between models and the empirical data. Okay. Settlement. So settlement of the Pacific is a superb example of human cultural capacity. The first time human societies became, maritime societies is when they crossed over from Sunda to Sahul, right? Moving from Southeast Asia into the greater Australia region, 40 to 50,000 years ago. And the expansion to the rest of the Pacific, right? It was the first time that people ventured to the most isolated parts of the Earth surrounded by water. And it has captured the imagination of many researchers who ask, how did this happen? How did they do it? Was there perhaps a strategy, perhaps an adaptive strategy, of oceanic movement? This part, correctly inferring mechanism, is usually done in the Pacific by constructing narratives about earlier radiocarbon dates, where you see here, sort of tiny, sorry, but we have movement, of course, the oldest dates here, moving out toward the east. Often by appealing to salient weather events. For instance, we can argue about the importance of tacking into the southeast trade winds or using winter westerlies during El Nino events. And then we can also use simulations showing how weather and current patterns may influence the speed and trajectory of oceanic travel. Other mechanisms revolve around behavior in the birth and death process that would produce a pattern consistent with occupying the better environments first. This would be such as the ideal free distribution, often used by evolutionary archaeologists. Others may argue about social structure. That same Peter Bellwood that published that book has suggested a, quote, founder-focused ideology, that the ethnography and the prototerms for sibling ranking by age and other linguistic evidence suggested the hierarchical chieftains that developed in Oceania acted as a pushing mechanism that led to the rapid expansion of peoples across the Pacific. Bruce Winterhalter and others thought it was a good idea, and in the ecological literature it was called the ideal despotic distribution, right? The ideal despotic, of course, meaning you have a despot acting as the push mechanism there. Bruce and I investigated this mechanism using a model, so you can ignore the math on the bottom if you're not used to it, but you can look at the pictures above there and just give a basic idea of what's going on here. We asked the question if subordinates can move despots can take, then what does migration look like as despots concede more or yes? And so we had a sort of two-patch environment there, movement between these two patches. Subordinates can move if they like to. Despots can take as much as they can from one of those patches, right? What would a subordinate do? Especially if one of those patches is the richer one, right? Who's extreme where the despot would be. We found using this model here that despots grow as concede less. This would be obvious, right? As they take more, they'll grow, right? As a hierarchy, at least that's supported by despots, would grow. And as despots concede less in high, they will concede less in high producing environments. They'll take more, right? And so we have concessions, of course, here. And so around 20% of whatever is total found in that resource patch will be taken by the despot. And as they take more, if the habitat is richer and richer on the right side of the graph there, they'll concede less and less. They'll take more and more. Okay? At least that's how you grow a despotic a society. However, despotism does not necessarily increase outmigration. And this was kind of a puzzle to Bruce and I. This was something that would be thought fairly intuitive, that if you provide incentives for individuals to leave, that they would do so. But the thing is that we didn't think about what despots take, right? So in Oceania, because of this sort of thinking, in Oceania, empiricists thought, well, when we think about canoes, right, they're big things, right? If you want a voyage in canoe, they require a lot of effort, and all the ethnography says you have a lot of steps that need to go with this, right? And in order to afford one of these things, you have to be pretty high up there. Meaning it's not the poorest people that move, right? In fact, the sociology of migration points to that, right? In order for, if despots take, they also take the ability for people to move. And so despotism itself does not predict either way in more or lesser movement by that argument. Rather, there has to be a disconnect, right? There has to be someone who's pushed out by despotism but still has the resources to move. And that's, of course, the sub-chiefs, the younger siblings of the chiefs. And that's the story that Bellwood and others would say, right? Is that the story about oceanic movement, or any movement, right, is about those who can afford to do so that are pushed out perhaps by someone who has more. Okay? This kind of tempered our excitement for the ideal despotic distribution, right? And I think there's lots of migration hypotheses to think, that we can put to this sort of test. The push and pull of migration, it can be a bit complicated when you think about the resources to do so and the distances for which they may migrate. Okay. Models are very important, and however, we did keep this hypothesis for the statistical analysis that I did subsequently on the Pacific. Here's a list of 4 hypotheses that I had there. One that Bruce Winterhalter is known famously for is for using for archaeological sediment patterns for ideal free distribution, and which provides the simple prediction that the more highly ranked patches would be occupied first. Right? The second is this IDD or Ideal Despotic hypothesis, where hierarchy is pushing things along. Another by Peter Shepard out of University of Auckland, wave of advanced model, which is kind of a bathtub model. If you were somewhere on, think of it as a null model. Right? Think about it. So if you were somewhere in the Pacific, and then you dropped, a rock there, and then the next island would be where the next wave would hit, right? And so it's just sort of moving out from the central point. And the fourth one was by Jeff Irwin, who liked to argue that that Pacific voyages were risk averse. They were adventurous, of course, in moving out across this sort of remote oceanscape, but they knew how to do it. That they would move they would tack into the southeast trade winds, and then under a failed search, they would come right back, using the winds to come back to where we were. And I like to believe Jeff, at least for that, because these are quite technical things to think about those who are not sailors. He himself told me that he went, for one summer, he took his small sailing boat and he went across and started here, went across and basically the path of Austronesian expansion of Pacific voyagers. And so, as a sailor, he sort of he thought that was the best thing to do. Okay? And so we had these 4 hypotheses of movement across the Pacific, of migration. And it can help us explain these things. Now, previous attempts at thinking about migration and simulating migration has been unsatisfactory, at least to me, because there were simulations without incorporating enough of the data. Right? They're useful tools for archaeologists to assess the viability of some routes, but they don't directly test the data we have, whether one process is more viable than the other. Such a constraint that approach that constrains the possibility of any one process using, for example, the settlement data you see here, island ecology, socio-ecological factors, would likely do better if we could, than the previous approaches. And so, in 2010, a statistician at UC Davis, Mark wrote within anthropology, he showed me a paper describing a new class of models that satisfy these requirements, right? It was dynamic. It asked, was something settled or occupied at any particular amount of time? In this case, it was about disease, right? Individual level model of disease, infectious disease. And I lifted this modeling approach that translated individuals passing disease from person to person to how islands are colonized by other islands through time. Okay? And it's really quite a neat model. It works like clockwork. With candidate parameters, each year the probabilities of being settled and not being settled are computed. And because of that, I call it the are you there yet model. And so every year you compute a probability. And that's exactly what my kids do during long drives, where they just ask you at random intervals, are we there yet? Imagine you can train your children to ask the question, are we there yet, according to some movement hypothesis, as opposed to sort of random sort of intervals, uniformly random intervals throughout the drive. And so this happens the same way, where you can do probabilities at each point, asking, are we occupied yet, depending on characteristics of the island, right? Susceptibility of island colonization, that's a term used from epidemiology, of course, but you can think of it, as far as distance or some other measure of effective distance. Ability of the island to colonize, that could be, you can think about population size or some other resource, it could be a proxy for resources. Accessibility of the other island from one to another. And so and taking the product of all these probabilities over time, it becomes the likelihood, statistical likelihood of the model, given the data. And it captured everything we needed to understand for being a dynamic model. And that's what we wanted. Right? If you're talking about movement, we need a model that moves with you. Okay? And so we collected this data about it. We collected about habitat quality, area, elevation, rainfall, helping proxies of that. I had a co-author, Tom Curry, who does ancestral state analysis, estimate as a hypothesis the hierarchical level of a particular colonizing island, right? Ancestral state analysis, as you know, provides a hypothesis for initial hierarchies using linguistic trees. And so there's a lot going on there that we can talk about, but it provides a hypothesis at least to think about what islands perhaps had that hierarchical disposition at settlement. Finally, settlement times are often not times or distributions, right? And so archaeologists will point out that, well, sure, you give me your earliest radiocarbon date, but you have a lab error, and then what if that's, what if there's all sorts of errors with what you're using, right? Or they're using coral, or they're using, and all of this. And recently, there's been advances in radiocarbon dating, and the question is, do you use old dates or new dates, and so on. So there's a lot of uncertainty around when things happened, and so in order to capture that uncertainty, we turned Bayesian. I made the data be parameters, right? And I used the distributions, create distributions after the mean, and using the errors you get from these lab errors you get from radiocarbon dates. Okay. And so you can use that, and so for each time an island is settled with some distribution around that settlement time, you can create a likelihood of a particular movement hypothesis given this data. Okay? And so you can create a number of different models that you look at here, whether you're looking at wave of advance, think of the bathtub model, think of the risk, movement into a certain direction. Think of this ecology, studying the habitats that are the best first, or think of hierarchy, looking at this perhaps despotic environments where the sub-chief or others may have moved quickly. And different variants of that model that I used, right? And then we have these two columns there. This is deviance information criteria, which is a Bayesian way of the analog of the ecological information criteria, which is using information theory to rank models, right? The lowest number, right, is what we're looking for, right? The models with the lowest numbers are theoretically supposed to measure out-of-sample predictive performance. And so think of this not as a hypothesis test, right? Think of it more as sort of a race between these different models, okay? Which model does better at explaining what's going on here, right? Or at least by these numbers here. And we can see here that island distance performs the worst, right? And then angle of target, which I'm going to explain in a second here, does the best. We see others there, such as risk is doing okay, and the ecology and the hierarchy models doing moderately, ecology not doing so well. The angle of target was something that Jeff Irwin constructed that says, okay, this is the margin of error for me that I'm having to work with in order to see this island, right? And so it depends on distance between the island and the size of the island. And so if I wanted to get from here to Hawaii, for example, you have a very small margin of error. It's fairly far away. If I was trying to go from Hawaii, the main island of Hawaii, to, say, Molokai, right, I can kind of see that island. It's pretty big. It's a very large margin of error, right? And so it's not just about distance, it's about the visibility of these islands, okay? And so that came up first. The thing about this result, it was kind of exciting to think about that, and I know Jeff Irwin was excited, right, of course. But the thing about the dates in the Pacific and all around the world is that they can be fairly variable, right? There's a lot of debate about these dates. And so what I did is I did a robustness test where I increased the dispersion around those settlement times. And so now, if you increase the amount of dispersion in settlement times, you can ask questions about, okay, how much uncertainty would still produce the same outcome that we see, the ranking of models we see there. And as you increase the amount of uncertainty, from 1 where it's the same, from 2 or 3 or 5 to 6 times the amount of dispersion around essential mean, we see that the same 3 models keep coming up as being important. Angle target, while it goes down, it still remains fairly prominent as you increase the uncertainty. The others 2 that were the risk ones, these 2 dashed ones, also remain fairly important. And so qualitatively, when we look at this, we say, well, they maintain at least for large amounts of uncertainty there. Okay? So distance, right? Not being very good. I explained this data here. Angle of target, very well. Risk, lightly so. Ecology, hierarchy, not doing very well here, especially not distance. It's often been the lore around oceanic movement across the Pacific that it's like a highway, right? They can deal with the distance, but they have a strategy in order to do so, right? There's a cultural repertoire built, toolkit that's built around moving across the Pacific that they used. Okay. And these 4 hypotheses, right? And so we can talk now. Well, I way in advance put 2 X marks. That's mostly for the distance one. But risk, right, movement, right, is what seems to be driving at least the movement across the Pacific here. Now, what's nice about doing things in prehistory, right, is that we can think from a large time scale. However, we do not know what happens on the short run that may have actually caused people to move in the first place. There are other hypotheses not here that we can also use, entertain also, but I think this is pretty good for a first time around. Now, what we don't see from these types of studies from the past are that the effects of migration on cultural traits as people leave a place or as people arrive to a new place. And this partly touches on a big debate as to whether things like population size matter, influences the suite of cultural traits we see, and a population. Okay. So I'm going to address these two things here. As people leave, what happens when people leave? In the Pacific, like other places around the world, you see a lot of rural-urban migration. Okay. Villages that where supposedly a few hundred people are down to 100, and people just joke around and ask them, how many people live in that village now? Oh, there's 2. Or 1, or they go there occasionally, right? And what happens when these sorts of things occur? And this is important from a basic science perspective, but also from a cultural revitalization perspective. People are worried about language and other types of cultural losses we're taking. The motivating model behind this next empirical example is from Henrik's 2004 paper, and is the model behind the demographic argument of population size influencing cultural complexity. I want you to keep this image in your mind for a moment, and this is, of course, if you move along the horizontal axis here, you're getting something more, right? You're doing better at something. You're gaining some increased amount of complexity, right? And the teacher has some amount, right, by that line there. So that vertical line there says what the teacher has. And this is, just think of your students, right, in class, right? And some of them may do better than the teacher, right? That's the tail here, you see to the right of this line. And some of them may do less well as a teacher, and the center mass is probably around here or so. Okay? And those parameters, alpha and beta, describe the distance from the teacher in the center of mass and dispersion. And the argument that Joe presents is that you have, if you have things that are really difficult, right, that the teacher gets and the students sometimes only get, and then there's fewer number of them, fewer teachers, fewer students, then you can end up in this region where you have skill deterioration, right? If things are simpler to capture, or there's more that's going on, more teaching opportunities going on, then you're up here, right, where you have skill acquisition. Okay. All right, and I want you to keep this image in mind too. Right? So weaving is important in the Pacific, right? And many women use that as a means for income, right? And they'll spend maybe 4, 5, 6, 12 hours a day sitting, right, weaving mats. And many of these mats are produced for local sort of social obligations, for life events, birth, death, marriage, but also for selling to Tongans who live overseas. There's lots of mats here in the LA Basin, right, from Tonga, and they're used for those things. And it's hard to imagine a Tongan wedding or funeral, anything without these types of cultural goods. And so you have these islands where the source of these goods, where the women spend hours and hours learning these things. Here we have an example where you have Lesieli here on the right-hand side. She is teaching how to make a new thing. It's not entirely new, because here we have something that was collected by Captain Cook, right, a few centuries beforehand. And here's something that she made. Shortly after Captain Cook got there, this type of basket was not made anymore. Okay? And here you have, and Lesieli, she reconstructed from an old sort of tattered example from in Tonga, from the basement of a high school, and learned how to make this. At least she self-taught a version of it, and she was going around the island teaching others to make it too, okay, as a source of income, right? They can use. And so, what's important here is that you have 15 or 16 different women weaving, right, trying out this new type of weaving method. And that's Miss Betty on the right in white. She's sort of mediating, of course, or showing how to do certain things, cutting strips of length and the weaving style. Discussing the length and the numbers of the strands.
Hai cái này ospite mà nó không biết được nhiều rồi sao?
Eventually creating starting with this new weaving pattern, using creating these baskets, right? And these baskets are, as they were weaving, or beginning to learn how to weave these baskets, those who were watching were already giving pre-orders, right? Oh, I want that basket she's making, right? Oh, I want that basket she's making, right? This is something new. This is something, that's tremendous. That's different, right? And so during this process of weaving, I would go around, and Sandros, who was assisting me, would go around, and we measure how people were doing. We measure the weaving rates of the women as we're going around, and we use that data, and we fit it to the Henrik model. Meaning, the question is, if you have a teacher, right, and you have a variety of students, how much variation do we see on the acquisition of this particular skill? And so we did it in different hours here. So forget the right-hand side, just look up here. So we have hours 2 to 3, right? And so we looked at what they've done, and we estimated the amount of centimeters per hour they were doing here. And we calculated that. We looked at hours 3 and 4, and then 4 and 5. Okay. We can see there were many who were struggling here, and there was a few at the end who were doing really well, right? Who were weaving quite quickly. The quality of their baskets were very good, and it was fairly consistent. They're consistently weaving this rate here. Now think of that first image I showed you from the Henrik paper, right, where you had that sort of that curve there, Gumbel distribution with the line where the teacher is. Now what I don't have from this data is what the teacher does, right? And that's the thing that's key here, right? And it's something sometimes you just don't do that thing in certain contexts, and so I didn't do that. But we can imagine, what if the teacher did this amount? What if the teacher was this fast or this fast or this fast or this fast, right? So if we vary that parameter, then we get a sense of what the scope might be for the need for population, I don't say population, but for learners, in order for this type of a skill to remain prevalent. And this is what we have here. Anything below the line means that you have deterioration or perhaps loss of cultural skill. Anything above the dotted line means, which means that greater acquisition of the skill here. And these two columns say they learn from the most skilled, meaning they're picking those who are best at it and they're becoming teachers. And for those average skilled, those who are more skilled. And so you see more, if the best are the best teachers, become the best teachers, then there's more above the line than this side here. Okay. What I got from this, fitting Henrik's model directly using this weaving data, are a couple things. First off, is that you have to mention the teacher, right? And second off, the debate around cultural complexity, I think, is going around in circles because we need more of this type of thing. We need to understand that what happens for particular things, okay? For particular things. For a basket, this may work. If you're talking about spearfishing, a tuna, maybe that may be a different question. Or if you're talking about, any type of technology, then we give a different learning profile that we just see here. Okay. A year later, I went back to Tonga and I looked up, the women who were doing this. And I asked them, how's it going, right? Are they still doing it? And I found out that, those who did fairly mediocre were doing okay, but they weren't. But the couple that were doing up here, they were being innovative. They were creating belts. They were making necklaces for their son's graduation using the same weaving techniques. They were creating all sorts of new things. And that was, there's a lot of reasons you can think about why they would do that, but it was consistent from the year before where they were the best, those who were weaving were those who were also the best innovators. I think, and they weren't even using the right material, by the way. They were using pandanus leaves. They should be leaving coconut strands, right? That's how it was originally made. But that was the easiest thing, that was the material they're most used to, so they started using that instead. And so, what I learned from this is that when we talk about demography, right, especially in a time when people are leaving the islands so rapidly, you can lose people like this. In fact, some of the people you see in the video have now passed on. And so that you'll lose a lot of cultural complexity depending on the thing you're talking about. And that I think it's a waste of time arguing about, these broad sort of scale yes or no sort of things. Does it influence everything, right? I think there needs to be a lot more work on specific types of skills. Going out and finding learning profile or learning distribution of skill levels for particular tasks. This is important, all right? And when you think about language, when you think about all other domains of culture, as people migrate away from these areas, migrate away from the Pacific, this is probably one of the central areas of concern, right? Are we losing our cultural heritage? And for certain things, probably. Let's shift to when people arrive. The destination of the migrants, for the Tongan migrants, is generally these three areas here, right? Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S. Okay. When you do this kind of work, so I go back and forth between the field. I go to Tongan Islands and I do work there, and then I come back to diaspora, and you see a contrast, right? And here on the left-hand side, you see Sione, who works on his land, right, in the islands. He plants different types of, subsistence horticulture, and with, supplementing with the market, buying food from the market. And then you have another individual on the right-hand side, lived in one of the most remote islands in Tonga, not just any, island, but the remotest island in Tonga, now living in Glendale, sort of Salt Lake City. Shoveling snow of all things. And you ask the question, how do individuals change, and their culture change from one environment to the next, right? Social, environmental, and so on. And so, in order to get at this, in some ways you have to think about how you can partition out what people do, right? There's, so I, earlier on in my graduate degree, I was, didn't know exactly what to do. But I knew that traditional knowledge was important. I knew that family was important. I knew that village relations were very important. And how that changed when people came across to the U.S. were important to me as they were, I guess, important to any basic science question, right? And those are related between those two here. Opinions, thoughts, behaviors about things about ability to make certain things, at least self-reported. Traditional dancing, food taboos for pregnant women, cause of sickness, right? Which is, you get usually one or two answers in the islands. You wonder if that is different when you come here in the U.S. Family relationships, it's a hierarchical society, Polynesia was, and it still is in many respects. Sibling ranking, right, by age, with often social power moving through the natural line, and a variety of other things. And so you want to know if that still carries over or plays out in the U.S. environment. And democracy, right? Democracy was something at the time of the survey that was being slowly introduced. They have a king, they have nobles, and they rule, and they have a certain amount of power. And they were wondering at this time whether they wanted to have more parliament. It was parliamentary democracy, and so they want to know, should they have more elected officials or not, and relinquish some of the powers of the king. And so that was kind of another important question, because in the U.S. you may think that it would go one direction, right? At least attitudes toward democracy. And so when you visit a village in Tonga and you interview and you visit the village of Glendale, right? Then you can make those comparisons. You can think about what are people taking and what are people leaving as they migrate. The taller bars here mean that they're closer, that they're different, more different from the Tongan sample, right? Different from the Tongan population than some of you. And so there's greater differences between the two. And when you look across this, the different questions I asked, or different topics I asked about whether they have respect for elders a certain way, where they make kava, they drink kava, which is a sort of a social drink, where they do this elaborate ceremony for the first Sunday after you're married, right? Whether you do a variety of other things. And the last one there, where children play in a certain way with their father, right? Or whether they rank families like that hierarchical way I was describing earlier. You can see that it's not, as far as how they adapt to U.S. life, it's highly partitioned, right? And the problem I've been trying to think about the last decade or so is why do you see this partition and what's governing that partition, right? What's creating this pattern here? Sticking to migration, these patterns of migration, right? There are other explanations we can think about here, but one thing to keep in mind is that some of these behaviors, some of these cultural traits are something you may acquire earlier in life and you may keep it for the rest of your life. Right? And so age of entry becomes very important here. Age of entry into U.S., for example, as far as kava, I mean, it may influence your use, but you're still some use amongst the immigrant communities here. Language proficiency, of course, that's well documented for many groups, that you'll see them. For those, if they enter after a certain amount of time, then, if they enter after they're 10 from Tonga, then they're fairly well speaking Tongan, right? But if anything beyond that, before that, meaning they come in earlier ages, then they may have very sort of rudimentary knowledge of the Tongan language here. And the right hand is a histogram, right? Census data on age of entry into the U.S. And what you see here are two things, right? You see that people, you have those coming in at younger ages, two modes here. Another coming in around when they're 20, which suggests we're having small families coming into the U.S., right? And you have a tail of those who are migrating when they're older, right? And usually, those who are coming when they're older are supported by those who are younger, right? And if we use if we combine these two things, both the demographic profile of migration, how they're moving, and this assimilation pattern, right, of depending on age of entry, then we could perhaps project what's going on, the contribution of migrants to the cultural diversity within a particular population. Okay? I used the model from Cavalli, Swartz, and Feldman in their book in '81, and it's I think one of the first of sort of cultural assimilation model. It divides up the frequency of a particular trait into two things. One's a contribution by immigrants, right, of new ones, and also the assimilation and contribution of those who came before, right. And what's nice about this is that you don't just say that all who are the source of this trait from the island all have this trait. Rather, there's a fraction that have it. And also, you can measure how fast does this particular trait change once they arrive in a new environment. And so you can look at flows of migration flow. And you can estimate those. I do it here, but you can estimate those different parameters, and then use this model to project forward what is the contribution of immigrants or migrants to the expression of a particular cultural trait here. And here, let's take a look. And let's focus on ranking families first, here. And so here on this particular graph here, we have different decades here. And so I use, census data to look at how many Tongans came in at a particular time across, 70, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010. And then, at that first year, on all of these graphs, it's gray, meaning that all for half the population believe that ranking families according to the hierarchy that I explained before was fairly important, and all of that came from new immigrants, because they were all new immigrants, right, coming in 1960. And as you kept moving on through time, because ranking families was not something that second or third generation Tongans thought was very important, then the only contribution for this particular behavior in the population was all from immigrants. Okay? And so it's all gray along here. In contrast, let's look at democratic reform, right? All gray because these are all new Tongan immigrants. And around 8% thought it was kind of good, right? At least from, or didn't have much opinion. And then over time, the contribution to that, to the Tongan population due to this particular trait became less and less, right? That means it was the second, the 1.5 or the second or the third generation that were increasing the amount of positive outlook toward democratic reform in the Tongan Islands. Okay? And so these are two contrasting cases here, right? Where a cultural trait is largely determined by migration flow, and here where it's not. Okay, where the second generation and onwards, they're maintaining, assimilating and maintaining this particular trait on upward. And there's other examples here. Sibling adoption, which is fairly prevalent across the Pacific. Adopting your brother's children or something is fairly common practice. That's fairly sort of doesn't change very much. Elaborate ceremony, you have some contribution from both second and third generation, and also a large contribution from immigrants. In other words, sort of like the basket example about what really matters to think, is really trait specific. The assimilation pattern, right? And a lot of it is developed dependent on the migration flow. How many coming? How many is coming? Who is coming? What age are they coming? Is it something that's sensitive to, that's time sensitive, or is a development window that they're using? Is it, and so on. And combining those two things with demography helps you sort of create hypotheses, at least, of what may be determining cultural variation you see in a particular immigrant population. Okay. Ethnic markers. Ethnic markers is kind of a special case of what happens in mostly immigrant communities here. Ethnic markers is an old concept. It's used in linguistics and used in sort of early anthropology to explain things that signify group membership. And some models that Boyd and Richardson and then McElrath later on with Boyd and Richardson created were able to show that these markers can be cheap signals, right? They don't have to be expensive. They can be cheap signals of group membership. Okay. And so markers and others have done some experimental work afterwards show that these markers can evolve, right, in experimental situations. And what's interesting about these markers is that they're highly frequency dependent, they're density dependent. They rely on the number of contacts you make with people from other groups and also from your own group. Okay? And it's very sensitive to that. And so I took the McElrath model and I made sort of an island mainland one-way population thing. And if this is the island trait and this is the mainland trait, and if you have continual movement of islanders coming to the mainland, then eventually, right, then this island trait will take over, right, if there's continuous migration of this amount. Very sensitive, right, to small amounts of migration down here. Now, empirically applying this particular insight by adapting this model was difficult. So I thought, okay, which immigrant population continuously migrates over time at the same rate and can create this pattern, which is, it's very sensitive, right, to migration. So you have to be sensitive empirically. And, so if you look at things like this, you get discouraged, right, to say that, okay, this is, if this is a good proxy of how people migrate to the U.S., then we're not talking about continual migration at any particular time. We're talking about sometimes pulses of migration or waves of migration over time, right? And which may be, maybe influenced by immigration policy or maybe influenced by economic situations and so on. And so I came a little discouraged there. I think that, well, if I was going to apply this, ethnic marker model to, say, Tongan populations, and I had, say, if I wanted to estimate a particular migration rate, I can't use it, right? Because migration doesn't flow this way. It's not just a continuous movement. Rather, it's impulsive. And so I began investigating about what it means to have a pulse of migration, a wave of migration versus continuous migration. And this is what I have. Okay. In other words, if I can think about it, does it matter if 10 people arrive now, or one arrives each year for 10 years, right? Does it matter? Okay. The expected migration rate is the same, but does that affect this hypothesis of ethnic markers? And it does, quite a bit. If the waves were higher, meaning 10 people, and only happened occasionally, then you can get a completely different pattern than you get if migration events happen more often. So let's say a migration happened 50% of the time, right, on the right-hand side there. Then, the host trait would kind of maintain itself, and the marker trait would kind of dwindle along, and there wouldn't be much change. But what if there was only a pulse of migration or a wave of migration, only 1% of the time, but it was larger, even though it maintained the same expected, right, migration rate as the other, but then you get these other different patterns, right? There was a migration wave here, it wasn't quite enough people. There was a migration wave here. This is a coordination game, right? All these ethnic marker ideas are based on coordination games. So when it went across, 0.5 or so, then this marker became prevalent in the population. You don't see that on the right-hand side here. And so if you can summarize this, that the frequency of the island trait in the host population, that if the probability of the migration event is smaller but it's larger, so much variability. And you get markers coming up, becoming prevalent at a higher probability than you would if you had a continual flow, a continual but lower flow. Okay? To me, this suggests that empirically, if we want to talk about migration and how it affects things like markers that are used to signify ethnic group membership, then you need to tease apart migration history at a finer resolution, perhaps, than what you get from a census, right? So you have to understand the amount of contact people have in a real population and ask them sort of, questions about that. Be tedious, and this is the tedious part, right? Asking where were you born, where did you move next, where did you go next, where did you go next? Now, who do you interact with? How many people do you know that are Tongan with you? How many people do you interact with? Do you know in school, and so on and so on. Do that, and then use demographic data at a finer resolution to understand what you should predict, what should happen with the evolution of these markers. Okay, I think marker theory is fairly sensitive migration, because if everybody is Tongan, you visit the Tongan Islands, nobody is wearing the Tongan power shirts, right? If you go to rural Utah and you have one Tongan that lives in the village, they're not wearing the Tongan power shirts either, right? If you go to an ethnic enclave that has other ethnicities around with you also, they're wearing the Tongan power shirts, having bumper stickers and things like that as a way to coordinate ethnic identity. And so it's very sensitive, right, to migration. And keeping track of that becomes fairly important. Okay. This summer, we're moving, this is stuff that we're still working on, as you can see. And so we're going around, so on this we have different communities here, and this is where I am here, right, in Salt Lake. And we have different communities around Utah, and the number on the left-hand side is the number of Tongans from the U.S. Census, and the number on the right-hand side is the number of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, an HPI, right? And so, what we're doing this summer is we're moving across, we're doing interviews, we're doing network surveys, and a number of other things, and to look at the whole sort of scale of migration across these different communities and ask the questions about the prevalence of ethnic markers. Okay. These are all, there's error around these, so there's probably maybe a couple in price, right? It's not just 0. And Vernal is 1 or 2, and Logan is 18. And so we're hoping that these symbols on the right-hand side that I collected in the islands, right, that I know are very important to Tongan identity, whether those become prevalent or not in these communities, or other symbols that are pan-Pacific symbols, or other symbols that use as ethnic markers become more prevalent, and some intermediate, density of the cities, right? Salt Lake is multi-ethnic, right? Lots of groups, just from observing, that there's lots of markers there. When you get to Logan, when you get to Vernal, when you get to Cedar City, with that, do ethnic markers become an important part of people's lives, right? And frictions, of course, are probably not. And so we're working on that this summer here. Another thing I'm working on, sort of in very close, is creating this sort of crowd science app. And so I have this I've been working on this web-based version right now, I hope we make it mobile, where you can, give a bunch of demographic information, right? Talk about some things about ethnic markers. It's not all the questions, this is an old version, so sorry. But also say a word, right? We can record your voice, and then use that voice to look for linguistic markers. So I'm working with a social linguist named Miranda Di Paolo, who works on Utah English, and we're looking at linguistic markers across Utah. And the way we can do this from a mobile version is have people sort of go on the website. I was hoping to have it done today, but there's a lot of technical server issues that we're dealing with in the next week or so I can show it off to you right now. Because what I would usually do is I can speak into my computer, and it'll analyze my phonetic qualities of my voice, and it'll match it with other people with similar phonetic qualities, and it'll show you through a network where you are. So it's kind of fun, right? I'm hoping to make it fun, right? So people can use it, right? If it's not fun, people can use it. So the end, the vision for this, is that using this as a neat data collection tool, but also to create a linguistic map of Utah that would be able to test these predictions about linguistic markers as well as other types of markers that may signify, right? They may help us understand the process of migration, because we have the migration history too, and the process of ethnogenesis, as sometimes it's called, about how groups divide or are created or evolve, right? There's an open question now that I'm really interested in, is that as Pacific communities and other migrant communities come here, do they, through linguistic and other traits, create their own group, right? And if they do, under what conditions does that happen, right? And so if 100 years from now there's a group that's derived from the Pacific that calls themselves a specific name, that speaks a certain way, that dresses a certain way, where do we see that? Will we see that in Salt Lake City, perhaps, right? It seems to be moving toward that way. Will we see it in other urban areas? And if so, what's promoting that, right? What's doing that, right? And hopefully, if we can, with tools like this, where we can get a larger sample of what's going on around the world, then we can create these linguistic or marker or behavioral sort of maps to see what's going on in real time. And so, I hope it wasn't too much, right? There's a lot of different things I have proposed here. Some of it was about archaeology, and some of the Pacific. Others was about migration, contemporary things. But I hope I spoke to the fact that migration can have a huge influence on our evolution, and explain much about our human condition, right? And it's so prevalent, and sometimes it's unsaid, right, about how influential it is that we sometimes ignore it, we control for it, right? When we think about settlement of the Pacific, dealing with uncertainty around archaeological, sort of radiocarbon dating, we talk about endemic migration, movements between, and the effects of that and how that happens, there's on cultural beliefs, right, and the loss of culture or the acquisition or creation even of a new one in a new place. A lot of that's very sensitive, of course. Hopefully I've conveyed the message, very sensitive to flows and migration. And also ethnic markers, right, and the coordinating nature of ethnic markers as they highly influenced by the nature of migration, that we need to pay fairly strong attention to the nature of demographic chains, not just birth and death, right, but also about movement. More recent work that I don't have time to talk about has been with Christina Moya and others thinking about essentialism. How we, at what point is it favorable to identify with groups or generalize individuals? And we'd like to think that migration is so prevalent that much of it is about how fertility, internal growth versus external growth governs attitudes, right? Depending on, do you live in a frontier community where expansion is the order of the day? Or do you live in a fairly constrained, sort of high population density community where control and order is what's gonna determine census attitudes? And as another set of models we're working on to help us think more tightly about these sort of things. And so, I think there's a lot of work to be done about migration, about detailing migration in real populations, about putting them together with models. and understand using those two things. You don't have to get too, it doesn't have to have fancy statistical models to do this. You just have to have a good relationship with their assumptions, right, and to work with them. Okay. All right, thank you. Yeah, Molly.
Thank you for this great talk, and I really enjoyed our conversation before, and I just want to sort of follow up on a couple of things you mentioned. So we were talking before about this idea of like moving targets of both the origin population and the host population. So with this population you're looking at now, I was wondering if you could comment on whether there is a, I've seen people mention this idea, this question, no one's ever answered it. Is there a point at which the migrant individual over either time in their life or more likely across generations can eventually be counted as a member of the host community and no longer a member of the migrant community? If they have, is there such thing as complete acculturation in which your ethnic identity then becomes Utah white and no longer Tongan? Is there a cultural aspect to that? Is there an ethnic marker aspect to that?
Right, and so you have to think about who's counting you in as your group, right? And so many of these migrants came in as part of because of the religious migrants, right? So Salt Lake especially, right? And they came in as migrants for the LDS community, right? And this here, this is in the late 19th century, so 1880s or so, there was a community of Hawaiians that moved to Utah, right? Of all places. Eventually they settled in this fairly barren landscape in just a valley over from Salt Lake, where they were there and they worked on the temple that was being built there at the time in Salt Lake, was the LDS temple there. And they became part of the community, even though they weren't. There were still some sort of racist tensions at the point against them, and some of them had, and so they weren't included, embraced completely by the community, but they were still became part of the community very quickly, right? And later communities, right, in the 1960s, 1970s, of other Pacific Islanders, they came in largely as religious sort of migrants, and they came and embedded themselves into a larger institution, and that happened really fast, right? What happens sometimes when these migrants move to a new place is that very soon afterwards, if they return back, they're viewed very differently. And so that's the dilemma that migrants face, right? If even for those who've gone away for just a short amount of time, when they come back to their homeland, the village views them very differently. And so and so their identity is it's sort of fuzzy words here, but in flux. They may not know where they belong. So that's why they have others who are like them. And so that immigrant community of those who are also moved at the same time. Think of that wave idea. If there's lots of you who are like you, right? Then you can form a fairly strong ethnic enclave fairly quickly here. If not, you may remain in between cultures a very, very long time, and you may not find anything established. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, Molly, but it's but what I can tell, it can happen very quickly. Very quickly, and if there's an institution that would support you coming in, then it happens even faster. Right.
Thanks, Adrian. Really stimulating material. I have two totally unrelated questions, one on the first part of the talk and the other on the third.
Yeah.
So on the first part, and I confess that my mind struggles with that level of thinking, but am I correct that, so in your model comparison, initially angle of attack did very well, and then as you increase the noise to signal ratio, the risk explanation did better. Am I correct that both of those potentially suffer from a survivor bias in the result? In that, so take the angle of attack as a simple explanation, right? You send out 1,000 ships, right? And they're most likely to end up leaving descendants on the islands that are the easiest to see, right? So all the other guys die, and they don't leave any descendants. So angle of attack right there is just a function of survivor bias. bias. And similarly, with regard to risk, if you think about it, if we go out with a navigational plan where if we fail to hit an island, we can't get back, then we just disappear from the sample. But if we use a risk-averse strategy where we can always follow the wind back again, then we stay in the sample, and you iterate that over time, and you end up with descendants from the people who stayed in the sample and not the ones who dropped out. So if that's the case, can the model take account of that? Is there some way of differentiating between those possible explanations?
Right, very indirectly. Very indirectly. It's hard to know what to include in the model, besides making it more complicated and maybe not get anything out of it to address that. The only thing that really saves us is New Zealand, right? New Zealand, Aotearoa, was settled last, right? And if you look at any one of those hypotheses, then you would say, what's going on here? If you combine the two, so if you think about what's angle and also risk movement into the trade winds, so perhaps you can come back. Then those two combined would suggest movement across and explain why New Zealand was settled last. And there's other examples of that to the north and west. That help explain what's going on there. But that'd be only partially satisfying. I don't know how to get around the survival bias, and without but that's a great.
Okay, so that interaction possibility raises another question. Let me mention that briefly, and then I'll come to my original second question, which is, doesn't hierarchy and distance or stepping stone have a similar interaction? So if it takes a bigger, more well-equipped expedition to travel to a more distant, harder to find island, then there should be an interaction with hierarchy if it takes more capital to mass those expeditions.
Right. And to answer that question, I need more islands. And so I did have an interaction term with that, along similar lines. And because the model became too complicated, I didn't get much out of it. The ideal scenario, I had to increase the sample size to test for that possibility. But that's a great suggestion. A lot of these models are constrained by, one approach, instead of having different models, is create one really big model and add in terms that says, does this matter, does this matter, does this matter, does this matter, right? And if I did that, then I wouldn't, I used a random walk, Metropolis, Hastings, a sampler for that. I wouldn't get anything, right? It would just be, the precision of the estimates would be really wide, right? It would be very small, meaning it's, the dispersion around the estimates would be really big. And so I'm hitting the analytical barrier there for that. But if I had a lot of money and a great grad student, right, I'd increase the sample and answer that next question.
Okay, let me turn very briefly and I'll yield the floor to others. So your argument with regard to ethnic markers and size of community with regard to coordination is perfectly sensible, falls straight out of the sort of existing approach to that. Can the causality, and they're potentially not mutually incompatible, but it strikes me as an analytic problem to differentiate them. Can the causality reverse so that if I'm a prospective migrant, right, and I'm choosing communities, now I realize that often it's where my cousin is or something like that. But suppose that, maybe it's not my initial settlement, but then I have the option to move after that. Okay? If I am, sort of very little acculturated, right? So I am extremely sensitive to the fact that I'm a stranger in a strange land here, right? And I have a choice between an array of communities. It would seem to me that I'm going to like the community most where I see signs that there are people like me, right? So that is the ethnic markers are prominently displayed, okay? And you can imagine, I drive down the street and I see a sign advertising food at a store or a restaurant or whatever, that I recognize that. That makes me feel at home. I like that, okay? So I settle there. Now, there you have the marker driving the community size, not the community size driving the marker.
Right, and so empirically, when we're trying to do these interviews, we try to decouple that. And you have to look at, sometimes you have to get into gritty details of why they left, right? And so the current sort of ethnographic survey we're constructing, looked at occupation You know, some of them are with, you know, some of those who work with like the prison system or those who work for government agencies. You know, we have to look at choice, right? And we're currently at that point, I mean, migration can be, I mean, it's hard to know without following somebody around, right, what's governing what. And so it's one of those slow science questions, I think, that eventually happens, where when we start these interviews and talk to people about you know, where their networks are, where they're moving, why they move, and where they're doing that, and that we have to follow them, right? And look for reasons of movement. I mean, a lot of it, I mean, it's hard to tell when people say I moved here because of a certain reason whether that's actually what's going on. I don't know what other approach to take. And so it's, I mean, at the broader level, the signs are obvious, right? When you're in one place, you don't see any. When you see another place, you see lots. When you see another place, you don't see any. And so something must be going on, right? And perhaps, you know, perhaps we should flip that question, right? And ask about migration strategies instead. Right. Thanks. Yeah.
Maybe this isn't necessary to the model, but just a curiosity. When you think about the motivation of the individual migrating from point A to point B, are you envisioning this as a I'm looking for a new home kind of situation, or I'm going here for the La Nina years and then I'll go back for the El Nino years over here, or something like that?
Oh, right. Sort of cyclical.
Yeah.
Well, in this case, it's very one way. It's very difficult to go back. In contrast to sort of border countries, right, where you can see that, and so they're here to stay.
Why is it harder to go back?
It's just costly, right? It just costs a lot of money to go back. Especially if you have a family, it takes several $1,000s to go back to your home.
What about just from island to island, though?
From island to island, it could be. It's less costly, but it's because land is owned by families, right? Then you have to have a family there in order to know where it is you can stay. Okay. And so, right. That becomes really important because, at least for this study, because when you think about perhaps if ethnic groups will form out of this migration process, then most theories suggest there has to be sort of a cutoff. Right, where they become isolated and they become their own, right? And so that's what I'm expecting. Yeah?
Do any of your migration models factor in birds and birds' migrations of islands? Because I can see a certain island might only have fruit bats, which would never leave the island, so it would be hard to see. But another island might have a lot of birds that either go out far to go fishing or at least migrate between islands, which would make it a lot more visible.
Right. No. So the angle of angle of target that Jeff Irwin uses. You know, he's a great guy. He's older. You know, he has these big navigation. He has big maps, right? Navigation charts he uses for sailing. And he goes and he takes an island and he measures a certain distance from the island, right? And so if it's a high island, you come out a little farther. If it's a low island like an atoll, you stay a little closer. And those are what we use, right? As opposed to other signs, you know, like clouds or birds and other things. And so, at least for this very simple version of the model, statistical model, that's what we did. Okay. Great, thank you.